Thanks very much, David, for that gracious introduction, although I have to say I have done a number of public speeches, and it's the first time I've been introduced as the fourth or fifth David to be at the podium. But that's probably good. And thank you very much, everyone, for the work you do every day and for also working together to learn from each other. What I'm going to talk about a little bit today is some lessons I learned from Toronto's experience and my experience as mayor, although some of the lessons are probably grounded in the time I was a city councillor as well. I represented Parkdale High Park for 9 years as a councillor and was originally on the regional government municipality of Metropolitan Toronto. So in my role as an elected official, I've always had to deal with issues affecting people, and it's really part of my core values. For those who don't know, I came to Canada as an immigrant. I came for grade 4. I was just turning 9 years old. It was just my mom and I, and we'd come from a tiny village in England. It was about 70 people who lived there. Mom was the teacher. There was a church which sort of ran everything, including the school. There were a couple of farms, a milk dairy behind us, an egg farm across the street, and a working blacksmith, and because it was an English village, 2 pubs. So, 35 people went to one and 35 to the other. But it was also a place greatly marked by class inequalities. And in the 1960s in England, you had to take a test at the age of 11. And if you didn't get a good enough grade, you weren't allowed to go into an educational system that allowed you to go to college or university. You had to take a trade. That was decided when you were 11 years old. And in our village, my mom was probably the only real professional, and the minister, I guess. There were landed gentry who owned all the land and who were, by our standards, very wealthy. There were farming people, and there were a few working people who earned very low incomes and lived in council houses. And they were my friends. Their children were my friends because they were the only other boys in the village. And when you see your friend's older brother fail the 11 plus when he's 11 and you're 8, it gives you a very dramatic sense of inequality and also for me, since an early age, the important role of government, particularly local government, in helping lift people out of poverty. Because although they didn't have much, they lived in dignity because council houses were decent, real houses at that time in England. So it's really, the issues you work with are really things that were ingrained on me from a young age and a core part of my belief and why I ran for mayor. So I said I'm going to talk about lessons I've learned. So that's the title of my remarks. The lessons I learned are really 3. The first is that we have to think about our policies based on place. And I understand you call that person-centered. I'm not a civil servant. I'm an elected official. It's much easier for me to think of place, neighborhoods in particular. And in the city of Toronto, we tried to think of our policies through a neighborhood basis. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So that's the first lesson. The second is the importance of partnerships. Partnerships between silos in the civil service. Of course, I know those of you who aren't from Toronto have no silos within your administrations. We're a very large government. We did have 1 or 2. And you need partnerships between those people. You need partnerships with the private sector. You need partnerships with other institutions, other governments, and nonprofit organizations. And I'll speak about some examples of that in a minute as well. The final point I want to make is a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, obviously they're from Toronto experience, a lot of it is done through innovative ways that actually don't require any extra resources. Requires careful thinking and application of that thinking, but if you're innovative and think about integration and partnership on a place-based approach, you can often produce quite extraordinary results without having to add extra resources. Sometimes you do, and as an elected official, I was not afraid to go to the people of Toronto and say we need extra resources to do the right thing for people and to make our city a better place to live. But often you don't, if you pull together the right partnerships and you think in a spirit of innovation. Just on the issue of extra resources, one of the things they teach you if you go to a campaign school, there actually are these things for politicians. You go to a campaign school and you learn about things like what it's like to be questioned by the media if you haven't been before. One of the things they always teach you is you cannot run for office and say that you're going to raise taxes. And if any of you paid attention to the US election last night, I know I did. I wish Mr. Romney had conceded earlier so I could have gone to bed. You know, the taxes were almost a taboo subject. Well, I actually think that's wrong, and I think people are prepared, if they believe you're using public funds wisely, they are actually prepared to pay taxes. And I know that because in the 2006 election, I ran on a platform that said, here's what we need to do for Toronto. We need to build transit, for example. We need to improve our human services. We need to make sure that young people in every neighborhood have a real chance, and it's going to cost money. So I'm going to raise taxes and bring in new ones. And there's not a political strategist in the world, including my own, who would advise you to do that. But I trusted the people of Toronto and got reelected. And I think you can have that conversation with people. And it's nothing to do with my presentation today, but it's something I firmly believe in. If you can demonstrate to people you're using public money wisely, they are well prepared to support you. So, place-based. We developed a strategy in the City of Toronto, and I think you've been briefed a little bit about this, called the Community Safety Plan. And it started after my first election in November 2003. And somebody in my office who used to be a civil servant named Sylvia Searles, I don't know if, I see a couple of people nodding. And by the way, I meant to start off with this, but I do want to acknowledge Heather McVicker's tremendous public service for, well, a long time. Heather's recently announced she's retiring, and everything I say today is credit to her and her staff in the City of Toronto. And Heather, I do want to acknowledge and thank you for your wonderful public service. And don't blush, it's true. So Sylvia Searles in my office was previously a civil servant, and we talked about community safety, and there was a real concern when I got elected, as there is today, with gun violence. And one of the issues for us was we believed it was neighborhood-based, and we believed intuitively that there was a correlation between certain kinds of crime, particularly drug-related crime, which is what results in the violence in Toronto, and places that have a lot of poverty and didn't have adequate public services. So we developed a strategy called the Community Safety Plan. Sylvia worked with the civil service, and it got passed by City Council in about March or April of 2004. It's one of the first things that I did. And it basically said, we're going to approach safety not just through a lens of an absence of crime, but we're going to approach safety through a social justice perspective. And the perspective is one of inclusion. You know, a safe community is people where there isn't crime and everyone is welcome and has a part to play in their neighborhood. And we did it with an emphasis on youth. Very important strategy. And that was the forerunner of some work that the civil service then did through partnerships with the United Way, the private sector, the federal government, and the provincial government. And we created a task force. And that task force led to the Strong Neighborhoods Report, with which you're probably familiar. And it led to us building the Community Safety Plan into something much bolder and stronger. The Community Safety Plan had picked 4 neighborhoods in Toronto where there were particular issues. Strong Neighborhoods Task Force said, when we look at these issues, of the 144 neighborhoods in Toronto, there are 13 with a very high correlation between low incomes and a lack of public services and public amenities. So some communities where there are low incomes, like Regent Park, were not a priority neighborhood because they have pretty good public services. There's a good school, there's a community center, there's a pool now, there's some other things. But many other neighborhoods in Toronto didn't have the public services that most neighborhoods take for granted. A library, for example. So young people growing up in Rexdale didn't have the same opportunities as young people growing up in Rosedale. We felt that was wrong. And what the Strong Neighborhoods Report said was, these neighborhoods should be a priority for investment by the city. And that's why we called them priority neighborhoods, and we made them a priority for investment. So when we were thinking about our park strategy, for example, our recreation strategy, when we were thinking about jobs, we would look to those neighborhoods first. And that's really important from a governmental perspective because it gave City Council a structure. So instead of having 44 members of council, all elected from different neighborhoods, fighting to say my neighborhood is the one that should have a housing expansion or library expansion or another program, there was already a structure. And I can tell you, as mayor with 44 councillors, it's pretty challenging to get anything through council. There's no political parties at the City of Toronto, although sometimes it seems like there might be political parties, but there aren't. So it's almost like you have 44 different political parties. So without a rigorous intellectual structure, it makes it very difficult for the council to actually make sure it's allocating the resources wisely. And that's what the Priority Neighborhoods was all about, and it gave us that structure. It also allowed us to do things like the Partnership for Youth Employment, PAY, which is an extraordinary initiative. Karen's here who runs it, in which we partnered without any additional resources to our social services department. We partnered with the private sector to bring jobs to the priority neighborhoods. Now, why did we do that? Well, one of the partnerships we'd formed was with the people themselves. Because I strongly believe that you're not going to do the right thing in government unless you knock on people's doors and ask them what their needs are and listen to them. And we certainly saw that in the development of the Community Safety Plan and the Priority Neighborhood Strategy. And before that, people were saying things like, kids need recreation, let's build some basketball courts. It's just kind of stereotypical. Well, you go speak to the young people in those neighborhoods. Sure, they want some recreation, but they also want opportunity. They want an opportunity to express themselves. They're very into music. And some programs started in music to help give young people training and jobs because that's what we heard from the young people. And most of all, they said, we want jobs. So that's how PAY started. And what PAY does is bring private and some public sector job opportunities right to the neighborhoods where the young people are and interview them there. And the city does the work to ensure that the young people are prepared. So it's kind of an interactive process. And it's really a partnership built with the community because it's the community that's saying, these are the kinds of jobs we want, and these are what our young people need. And one of the things that I saw from my perspective as mayor, these programs were so successful that they caught the eye of the provincial and federal governments. And early on in the Community Safety Plan, this changed when Paul Martin lost as Prime Minister because he and Stephen Harper have a different way of thinking about municipalities. But when Paul Martin was Prime Minister, we had actual federal cabinet ministers sit on a city-led committee that was overseeing the priority neighborhood strategy. And we had provincial representatives and very senior level civil servants from the city, from the province, from the federal government, working together on this place-based strategy. And one of the results is that, certainly in our conversations with Ottawa, they started to think about place-based strategies much more. And that's because we'd led and we were showing that it worked. And what might be needed in Malvern, for example, or Rexdale, might not be the same thing as is needed at Jane and Finch. It might be completely different things that are needed by the people there. And the federal government, at least in my time as mayor, began to understand that and started to support programs for investment on a neighborhood-by-neighborhood basis. I have to give one more example of a partnership in the Community Safety Plan that worked very well, and that's with Microsoft. Microsoft came and said, we want to participate. And in Rexdale, we opened a training center with the partnership of Microsoft, Humber College, the Y at the beginning, and another nonprofit partner, and the city. And we put very little, if any, money into this. Humber College did the training. We were more a facilitator. Microsoft supplied the software. And what these centers do is they create a state-of-the-art environment for young people to learn advanced computer graphics. And it was called the ProTech Media Center. And it was so successful that Microsoft partnered with us in Scarborough to open a similar center and then took the idea across Canada. And they're replicating it across Canada and I believe in the United States as well. And that was a partnership approach in which we took opportunity because Microsoft approached us. And our social services department knew the needs of the community because they'd been listening. And young people in Rexdale have been saying, I'm really interested in computers, but I can't afford to get the kind of support I need to really learn. And there was a wonderful article in the Globe and Mail where Jennifer Lewington, who was at the Globe then, interviewed a 13-year-old boy who decided that he wanted a job in future as an inventor of video games. Now, that's probably not surprising. Most 13-year-old boys want that kind of job. But you know, if you're growing up in Rexdale, you probably aren't able to dream that because you don't have the opportunity. And this boy had the opportunity. And the article came out in the Globe, and that night I was at an event at the Board of Trade, completely coincidental with the information technology industry. And they were talking about what was needed in Toronto. And I said, well, to one guy, what do you think? And he said, you know, we're doing really well in IT support for people like Bell and the big banks, but what we don't have is a gaming industry. We need to create a gaming industry here. And I said, well, I've got the employee for you up in Rexdale. So it was an interesting synergy, but it also showed me why the program was the right thing to do, because it was actually creating a real path for this young man who was the son of New Canadians to have a real chance in life. So these are the priority neighborhoods. And I think people, even if you're not from Toronto, are probably familiar with them. Jane Finch, Jamestown, which I've been calling Rexdale, Steeles, Lamoureux, Malvern. In all of those neighborhoods, there are existing projects now and projects that were started once the report was written that are based on the same principles. They're working through partnership, they're thinking about youth first, and they've listened to the community and are trying to meet local community needs that have been expressed by the community. And yes, some of those have public funds in them. But it's public funds that we would likely have spent anyway, but not on the priorities. They would have been invested perhaps in a priority setting on which parks need repair, not which parks serve the people who need parks the most. There are city investments, I think, in all of those neighborhoods. So a related issue for us that was happening at the same time was very important, was childcare. And I want to talk about this because it illustrates a little bit of a different point, which is connected to place-based, but it's also about leadership. We knew that the federal Liberal government was going to bring in a childcare strategy. We knew it because they'd promised it in the election, and while, of course, election promises don't always seem to be definitive of what happens afterwards, we'd been talking with the people in Paul Martin's government, and we knew that they were sincere about this, and they were intending to bring in a national daycare strategy. So we didn't wait for them to bring it in. We developed a strategy ourselves to open 63 new childcare centers, mostly in Catholic schools, which we had never done before. There'd never been a partnership in the history of the city of Toronto between Toronto and Catholic schools. And most of those childcare centers were in the priority neighborhoods. And that's for an obvious reason. In the priority neighborhoods, most people are working 2 or 3 part-time jobs, and they can't work without childcare. And so we were ready to go. And the moment that the federal government passed the relevant legislation, we got our application in. I think the very next council meeting, the strategy was adopted, passed, went up to Ottawa, and we got the funding, and we actually opened 63 new childcare centers. And the difference it made was extraordinary. There was a man at one of the schools who was the custodian. And I was at a ribbon cutting for one of the childcare centers. And by the way, if you want huge media attention, do not open a childcare center. No, we opened this childcare center, and City TV, in its previous incarnation, came, and one reporter from the Toronto Star. There was a murder near that childcare center a couple of weeks later, and Global TV alone had 3 television cameras there. I found that a very depressing comment on the state of Canadian media. But in any event, this ribbon cutting, the custodian came up to me, and he was probably a 60-year-old man, fairly heavily accented English, and he held onto my arm and he cried. And he said, Mr. Mayor, this is so important to me. My wife has died, my son's been alone by himself, and now he has somewhere safe to be. And I just, as you can tell, I still find it emotional. I just found an extraordinary moment because it spoke to me of the incredible, it's not just an academic importance to people to say you have safe early learning opportunities for your children. It's an incredibly powerful need for parents. And Had the Harper government not canceled the second stage of the National Childcare Strategy, we would have opened another, I think, 37 more childcare centers, and the wait list in Toronto would have been down to 3 months, which essentially is no wait list at all. So it was an incredibly meaningful approach, but it illustrates again two of my themes. It was done through partnership with the federal government and the Toronto Catholic District School Board, and it was place-based, because almost all of these were in priority neighborhoods because that's where the priority was and the need was. This photo is only here because it's a really cute photo. Like, how can you resist? It just makes me so happy to be, they are children in a city-run or a city-supported childcare center in Toronto. It just makes me so happy to be a Torontonian. That's lovely. Uh-oh. Okay. So the clicker's not working. Oh, there we go. Now, I know that no one in this room runs a public transit system, or I don't believe so. Does anybody in this room run a public transit system? Okay, so I do know that nobody runs a public transit system. But I wanted to talk about the City of Toronto's transit plans because it's very relevant to this place-based approach. And it's also an illustration of both the idea of partnership and integration. Because our transit plan is not just about transportation. It's also an effort to connect lower income people into the fabric of this city, and it was quite consciously such an effort. So as you may be aware, the City of Toronto's transit plan, known as Transit City, although its name has changed now, essentially the same plan got reaffirmed by City Council just last week. It was launched in March of 2007. I ran in the 2006 election, the one I said, I'm going to ask you to pay more taxes and I'm going to bring in new ones. One of the commitments I made was to build a new rapid transit network because Toronto is 30 years behind. You know, the TTC is actually excellent, but it's excellent for a city of about 1 million or 1.5 million. This is now a city of nearly 3, the heart of a region of 6. And pretty much literally the transit system hasn't expanded at all. So 2006, I'm re-elected December 1st is the first day of the new council. March 2007, the TTC developed this strategy. June 15th, 2007, Premier McGuinty announces full funding for this whole strategy. I remember the date very well because June 15th is my wedding anniversary. And the one commitment I made to Jill when I got elected mayor was that we would always take that day off and spend it together. And we usually do things like go to Stratford. And we used to have a lovely day as a couple. So I had to phone Jill when I found out the Premier was inviting me to this event, which of course I had to go to. You can't not show up when somebody brings one of those big novelty checks for $8 billion. It's a big check, right? $8 billion. It's a very large check. So I phoned Jill and I said, Jill, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to spend our wedding anniversary in a bus garage in Mississauga. And my advice is don't have that conversation with your significant other. It's not very productive. The next year we had to go to Madrid. So I needed the giant novelty check. Can we go back to the previous? Yeah, thanks. So that's the timeline. The TTC started engineering and construction actually began on Shepherd East in December 2009. And the first idea of this, of course, is to solve Toronto's transportation problems by rapid transit in an affordable way based on a technology that meets the needs of less dense suburban neighborhoods, which is light rail. Very important. Second issue was environmental, of course, very important as well. But a third issue, and a critical one, was about connecting priority neighborhoods into the fabric of the city. And if you talk to people in Toronto who are working 2 or 3 part-time jobs, the first thing you know is they're very, very likely to live in a place where their main transportation is the bus. And people can understand why. It's very expensive to run a car. If you're going to 2 different jobs, have to park twice, it's a lot of money. You're going to take the bus. And when we were planning Transit City, I took the bus from Shepherd East, actually a bus down to Shepherd, with an assistant who worked in my office, just to see what it was like. His commute was
from there to York University. So that's what I took. But on the Shepherd East bus, I met a woman, and I said, where are you going? And she said, the airport. And I said, why are you going to the airport? And she said, that's where I work. And I said, so you do this every day. How do you do it? And she said, well, she takes a bus to Shepherd, then the Shepherd bus, then the subway, a bus on Finch, and then another bus to the airport. That's a really long commute. And I said, you got a long day. And she said, yes, but I only work there part-time. In the afternoons, I'm a cleaner at the Royal York Hotel. So she takes 2 buses and the subway down, and then to get home at night, takes the subway, the bus, and the bus. So it's something like 9 bus trips, 5 subway trips. She literally spends 3.5 or 4 hours a day on the bus, literally, or the subway. And adding rapid transit lines for her would give her an hour or 2 of her day back. So what could she do with that? Well, like my mom did when she was in her 50s, she might go back to school, give her a better opportunity. She might be able to be home for dinner, right? Spend some time with her family. She might be able to participate in something in local politics in her community, which she's virtually excluded from because she's on the bus. And one of the things about Transit City, although it's a rail-based strategy, it had the same thinking underlying it that I was talking about in the priority neighborhood strategy, because Transit City, go ahead, the lines, those clusters I'll explain in a moment, but they're basically in the priority neighborhoods. They're clusters of high-density housing. The lines go through the very neighborhoods we were talking about. They serve Rexdale, they serve Malvern, and they connect, and it's for an obvious reason, because they're replacing the highest frequency bus lines. But if we hadn't been thinking about priorities and we hadn't been thinking about partnerships, we wouldn't have developed a transit strategy that actually met the need of the least well-off in this city. And it's one of the reasons this is the only issue that I keep speaking up on since I didn't run for re-election, because it's my view, if I wanted to comment publicly, I should have run for re-election. But this issue is so important because when people do things like cancel the Finch LRT, which the province did, or defer Shepherd, which the city did, what they're actually saying is the least well-off in our city are not going to have a chance to reclaim those 1 or 2 hours a day that are going to give them real opportunity. And it's something that I think is fundamentally wrong and not considering the real needs of Toronto. And if you think on a place-based partnerships approach, you get a very different solution, the kind of solution we came up with. Now this maps here actually to show 2 points. One is about Transit City. A second is about another program to illustrate this partnership idea and this integrated thinking idea. And it's an environmental strategy called Tower Renewal. And it's about these particular style of apartment buildings. I'm sure you're familiar with them. They're in every major city in Canada. They were built with CMHC funding in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I note the slide, thank you, CMHC, for advancing affordable housing solutions. I've got one here for you if you're, is the representative here? No, okay. Well, they were funded by the CMHC in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They're concrete, they're great housing, and they'll be here forever because concrete's here forever. But it also has one other property. It's a terrible insulator. So they're incredibly wasteful of energy. A one-bedroom apartment, like one of these here, uses more energy to heat and cool than a small house. And that's something I didn't know. A professor at the University of Toronto, engineering professor, analyzed these buildings and said, you know what, because of the energy wastage, if we insulate them from the outside, which is very inexpensive, about a 7-year payback, we can make dramatic greenhouse gas reductions. And so this was brought to me by some other University of Toronto academics, architects, who'd taken that idea and added architecture to it. And they said, you know, we've got a great environmental strategy for you, Mr. Mayor. You can reduce Toronto's greenhouse gases by 5%, which is almost the first Kyoto target, simply by insulating buildings in a way that there's a 7-year payback, and we'll beautify them as well, and you'll rejuvenate neighborhoods. And we said, thank you. Fantastic idea. But what we did was took it into the city, and we looked at it from a social services, human services perspective, neighborhood-based, and also from an economic development perspective, because it's all connected. And we said, you know what? Most of these buildings, not all, but many of them, are in priority neighborhoods. So what are we going to do with the buildings? And we created a program called Tower Renewal. that actually uses that principle of going out and literally knocking on the door of the people in the buildings and saying, we've got a city program that's going to help rejuvenate your buildings. It pays for itself, but we want to know what you want to happen as they're rejuvenated. A really important part of the engagement, and that's being done in priority neighborhoods. And if you visit one of these buildings in a lower income neighborhood, you'll see that certain facilities have often deteriorated. They might have been built originally with a pool. And the landlord can no longer afford to keep the pool running. So there's an empty pool sitting outside. They were built originally because of CMHC and city requirements without any commercial space. So people have to literally drive to get their groceries. Because they're in neighborhoods where they're predominantly served by bus, not by LRTs. And that's a whole range of things. In fact, in some buildings in Toronto, if you know your way around the building, you can go to apartment 1607 and get your dentures fixed or replaced. You can go to apartment 1532 and get your hair cut. You know, you can all sorts of other services. And people are very creative and entrepreneurial. And they're creating these little businesses in the building because there's no commercial space at the bottom. So our program goes to the people and says, what do you want? Do you want a rezoning commercial? Do you want to take this old pool and fill it in and create a recreation space for youth? And we're doing that with exactly the same philosophy as the priority neighborhood strategy. And we're also adding in conscious thinking about jobs. So the Tower Renewal Office is working with the construction trade unions to help train people who live in the neighborhoods with the technical skills needed to actually work on these energy retrofits in the buildings they live in. And we use that philosophy with the Regent Park revitalization. 25% of the jobs had to be local so that the people who needed work the most are getting them. And I like this example because it combines the environment, it combines local, it combines neighborhood-based strategies, and it also brings quite significant employment. It takes about 30 people a year to do an energy retrofit on one of these buildings. There's 1,000 of them in Toronto. That's 30,000 jobs as calculated by the federal government in its announcements. So I always refer to it as 30,000 jobs. Hugely important in neighborhoods to bring the jobs right there. And that's what we'd heard from the young people, as I said before. So a couple more points I wanted to make, and then there's a little bit of time for questions. And excuse me, I've spoken about partnerships and innovation, and the last 2 points I want to make are about those. And I know Heather's still doing some work on these issues in Toronto, but one of the strategies we developed was a strategy to help street-involved homeless people, to help them off the street. And it's called Streets to Homes. There's a very similar kind of approach in New York City. I'm always a bit sad when I read about New York City's approach in the Canadian media because it's often cited in the Globe and the Financial Post, and nobody ever talks about Toronto's approach, which actually in many ways is better than New York City's, and for reasons I'll explain in a moment. But it's an approach that works, and there's international experience to support it. And Streets to Homes, the basic idea in Streets to Homes is that you get to know the people who are street-involved homeless, find out what their needs are, and connect them directly to housing, not to a shelter, and have the supports in place so that they can be supported in that housing and stay there. A friend of mine who works in the mental health sector calls it a roof, a friend, and a job. And what he means by friend is all of the social services that you and others provide that helps people who are most in need. And this works. About 90% of the people who've been helped from the street by our city-funded outreach workers actually stay in the housing that they're in. That's an extraordinary number, as I'm sure you know. And what do we need to do this? Well, we needed a lot of partnerships, and we needed some real goodwill from the provincial and federal government. So we had housing allowances that helped. We had a very smart strategy that was developed by the city, and we led with the strategy just like we did in childcare, and the federal and provincial governments followed because they were persuaded that it was going to work. And I think that's an important thing, by the way, that municipal governments can do. We can show leadership and innovation. And when we take a really good idea to the federal and provincial governments who control the funding, they'll use it if it works. And I think that leadership, that's not something Toronto's the only place that's capable of showing it. Everybody's capable of showing that kind of innovation and leadership. So we developed the strategy, and at the time we developed it, there were something like 75 to 100 people typically sleeping out at Nathan Phillips Square, right in front of City Hall. And that's the place of the people in Toronto, our most important civic space. City Hall in Toronto is the most photographed building, more than the CN Tower in the city, our most important civic space. And it sent a real message about how we were not caring for people who needed it the most, that Nathan Phillips Square was the place where people slept. And by the time the strategy got going, there were almost no people sleeping on the square because they had somewhere to go. Some had gone to a shelter. We opened a nearby shelter. But most were helped by street workers who got to know them and then were helped off the street into an apartment. Most of the housing was private through housing allowances. And we worked with our partners, places like CAMH and others, other service providers, to make sure the services were there and were tailored to the individual. So some people might need addiction counseling, many needed mental health counseling, some needed job services, some simply needed some stability in their lives, and a place was what they needed. And those services were connected with them directly, and it worked tremendously well, and I think it's a fantastic model. Last point I wanted to make was in 2008, the financial crash hit. And by the way, I have to say one thing I'm proud of at the City of Toronto, even through the financial crash, our credit rating trended up, unlike perhaps all of the major corporations in North America. So if people tell you in government you can't run things properly, just tell them that's not true. And just look at what happened in municipal governments in Ontario, which are quite well run. We didn't run into nearly the same financial challenges. We are very, very worried about the people of Toronto, and we realized we had to make economic development and connecting people with jobs a key priority for the City of Toronto from 2008 on. And so we developed a whole range of strategies. Every department was tasked with bringing forward strategies for my consideration and then ultimately the approval of Council that would make a difference in real people's lives because of the recession. And Heather and her department created a partnership with the Y, and this partnership speaks to me about the innovation point, because this cost us virtually nothing to do this partnership. And what we did, there's a social services office on the ground floor of Metro Hall, and it's next to what used to be a restaurant, and we tried to tender it and nobody wanted to run it. And so we took the kitchen facilities of the restaurant and in partnership with the Y, turned it into a training center for people who wanted to be chefs and other food service workers. And they were people who were on assistance and who might be using the very office that's right next door. And it was innovative for us to bring another nonprofit into our space to do this, and the results were incredible. And we had ribbon cutting to open the center, and I think it was the woman in front here, her husband, this remarkable man. He was from Nigeria, and he'd had a job and he'd lost it and was on assistance, and he was a very proud guy, and he was so excited to be trained as a chef. And it just made my heart sing. You can see how big a grin I have in that photograph. And he spoke so well and articulately about the opportunity this gave him. And for us, this was very different. Instead of referring people out to employment agencies and training programs, we brought the program right into our facility and trained people right there. And it's been phenomenally successful. I don't know the latest statistics because I'm not the mayor anymore. But to me, it was a very innovative approach to trying to solve a real problem, which was we're in the middle of this financial crash. The private sector isn't really hiring. How are we going to get people jobs? How are we going to get them the training they need? And how are we going to do it on a very limited budget because we simply don't have the money to run a big program? And it worked tremendously. So what lessons do I take from this? Well, place-based matters. Partnership matters. Being innovative and showing leadership as a municipal government really matters, because that's where we can make an incredible difference. And all of the programs I've talked about are municipally led programs where we did the thinking and the innovating. And I think we're really good at that. because we know people in their homes where they live. And that's our job as a municipality. The provincial and federal jobs are a little bit different. They're to think more across places. That's what works in my experience. But I think there's more to do. And I think the biggest challenge we have is to make sure that the provincial and federal governments still stay aligned with those municipal priorities of municipal leadership. And in particular, make sure that they keep thinking about place-based strategies, because they work. And in Toronto's experience, we've literally helped thousands of people get off the street. We've helped thousands of people get decent jobs. And we will be helping hundreds of thousands of people get around the city who in the past couldn't. And that came about because of this approach, thinking about place, thinking about innovation, and building creative partnerships. I'm sure that's what you do every day. That's what we tried to do in Toronto. I really appreciate your time and attention, and I think there's a few minutes for questions. Thank you very much. So there is a few minutes for questions or comments, answers. Oh, and there's mics.
Hi, Mr. Miller. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Candace Gowdy from the region of Waterloo. Thanks for sharing some of your journey and all of your success stories. They've been great. Mr. Miller, in the room today, you have various levels of governments, from municipalities, DSABs, and provincial partners. If some of us aren't as compelled to move forward with human services integration, what 3 compelling reasons would you leave for us to really embrace that direction and move forward with it?
Well, I'll give you 2. So the first one is it works. You know, all of these examples I gave are examples where there was an integrated approach. We may not systemically have been integrated, but there was an integrated approach. Even between an environmental initiative and human services, there was an integrated approach. And it works. It answers the problems, and everything's connected. I don't think you can think about economic development unless you're thinking about how that economic development is going to support everybody and make sure everybody has a real chance. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, I also think it's a vastly more efficient use of public resources. And in a time when budgets are constrained, it might take some more time and thought to do these approaches properly. And so there's a little bit of money there to make sure you've got people that are doing that time and thinking. But on the other side, there are significant savings if you do it right. I mean, think about the savings to the systems from streets to homes. And I can't quote the figures anymore, but they're in the millions because of the number of emergency visits that street-involved homeless in the city of Toronto, it'll be true in Waterloo and anywhere else, make each year. Something like 57 visits on average. And every one of those visits is extremely expensive to the medical system. And if you're able to help somebody into a home, an apartment, and provide them the services and supports they need, their number of medical visits will drop dramatically. And if they have them, they're more likely to have one that has an appointment, like a doctor, than go in an emergency room. So there are huge savings. I mean, one of the challenges is to those of us from the provincial government, I know there's people here, you see the savings at the province. We don't always at the city. Because if there's savings to an emergency room, well, maybe there's fewer ambulance trips, that saves us a bit, but there's significant savings to the province. And I think there needs to be some thinking provincially as well about how those economic calculations are done. Because if you think it through properly, you will end up with a system that reallocates those resources to what is in essence prevention. So those are 2 reasons. They're both long though. So, okay, those are good reasons. Well, I don't see any other questions, and I think this is the end of the day, so I'll cut it there. I really appreciate the invitation today. It was terrific, and thank you, and continued success in all of your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for coming to speak to us today. Your themes of place, partnership, and innovation, I think, ring true with the work we do and the discussions we've had these last couple of days. In lieu of gifts for our speakers, we'll be giving a donation to the Daily Bread Food Bank's People's Blueprint project. The People's Blueprint is a unique and empowered group of men and women with lived experience of poverty and all it brings with it. As a group, they have learned leadership and peer research skills and conducted over 1,000 video-recorded research interviews that demonstrate the hopes, challenges, and abilities of people living on social assistance in an intensely personal manner. The goal of this project is to change social assistance in Ontario for the better.